What happens when there is no Stark in Winterfell? It becomes broken and winter falls. We see this happen in A Song of Ice and Fire, so let's take a look. Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek, particularly if you're here for the first time. On this channel we cover A Song of Ice and Fire in nerdy detail, as well as The Lord of the Rings and The Witcher. Welcome. This is the second in a series of videos about the Starks and their centrality to the plot of A Song of Ice and Fire. In the first video in this series, we looked at the phrase, "There must always be a Stark in Winterfell," and concluded that although it clearly had some very practical political advantages for the Starks, there was likely also a more magical explanation from the founding of Winterfell itself, or more precisely, from the founding of the crypts. "There must always be a Stark in Winterfell" has meant that the Starks have been buried in the Winterfell crypts every generation for an extraordinary 8 millennia. Perhaps the biggest bit of supporting evidence for a magical explanation for the saying would be to see what happens when there is no Stark in Winterfell, as happens when Bran and Rickon leave at the end of A Clash of Kings. Simply put, if that phrase were just a political slogan, we might expect there to be no particular impacts. A power vacuum, perhaps, but nothing that appeared particularly magical. But if there is a magical bond between the Starks and Winterfell, then Bran and Rickon abandoning Winterfell after 8,000 years of Starks being there should have some pretty significant magical impacts. So, what happens when the Starks do leave Winterfell? Well, to start with the more mundane political implications, obviously the Boltons step into the political vacuum and are the new leading house in the north, supported by the Lannisters and the Freys. But still, as the Liddell that Bran and co meet en route to the Wall says, "When there was a Stark in Winterfell, a maiden girl could walk the King's Road in her name-day gown and still go unmolested, and travellers could find fire, bread and salt at many an inn and hold fast. But the nights are colder now, and doors are closed. There's squids in the Wolf's Wood, and flayed men ride the King's Road, asking after strangers. It was different when there was a Stark in Winterfell. But the old wolf's dead, and young ones gone south to play the Game of Thrones, and all that's left us is the ghosts." We'll come back to the ghosts in a bit, because that's a bit of imagery George R. R. Martin uses a lot here. For now, let's note the obvious practical and political implications of no Starks at Winterfell. A loss of the rule of law and even non-Northerners quasi-ruling in the heart of the North. People are scared and no one feels safe. But for the magical implications, let's start with Bran's thoughts as he leaves Winterfell. We read this. "At the edge of the Wolf's Wood, Bran turned in his basket for one last glimpse of the castle that had been his life. Wisps of smoke still rose into the grey sky. Soot stains marked some of the arrow loops, and here and there a crack or a missing merlon could be seen in the curtain wall. But it seemed little enough from this distance. Beyond, the tops of the keeps and towers still stood as they had for hundreds of years, and it was hard to tell that the castle had been sacked and burned at all. The stone is strong," Bran told himself. "The roots of the trees go deep, and under the ground the kings of winter sit their thrones. So long as those remained, Winterfell remained. It was not dead, just broken. Like me, he thought. I'm not dead either." Those are actually the last words of A Clash of Kings, so we can probably take them as quite important, both for Bran and Winterfell. Bran reflects that as long as the stone remains strong, the tree roots go deep, and the Stark statues in the crypts are still there, Winterfell remained. It wasn't dead, whatever it may look like. But for the time when the Starks weren't there, it was broken. Which sets up an important distinction. Winterfell will look dead above ground without the Starks, but as long as the original Winterfell, the stones, roots and crypts underground remain, it will just be broken. Remember that reflection by the Liddell, that all that remained were the ghosts? That's what Winterfell looks like above ground in the absence of the Starks. Dead. We don't actually get to see Winterfell for 2.5 books after Bran left, but this is the scene when we return from Theon's POV. It felt like some strange underworld, some timeless place between the worlds where the damned wandered mournfully for a time, before finding their way down to whatever hell their sins had earned them. Are we all dead, then? The death imagery is strong and appears again and again in those Theon chapters. It's telling us about him and his state of mind, but also George R. R. Martin is telling us about Winterfell. Clearly, above ground, Winterfell is dead. That last quote was from when Theon was in the Godswood. What Theon sees elsewhere is different, but just as arresting. A hard white frost gripped Winterfell. The paths were treacherous with black ice, and hoarfrost sparkled in the moonlight on the broken panes of the glass gardens. Drifts of dirty snow had piled up against the walls, filling every nook and corner. Some were so high they hid the doors behind them. Under the snow lay grey ash and cinders, and here and there a blackened beam or a pile of bones adorned with scraps of skin and hair. Icicles, long as lances, hung from the battlements and fringed the towers like an old man's stiff white whiskers. Winter has clearly fallen. In and of itself, this is nothing special. The white ravens from Old Town signalling the coming of winter had been sent perhaps a month earlier. We should expect snow in Winterfell. No, what is noteworthy is how this winter seems to hit Winterfell so badly, so quickly, compared to pretty much everywhere else. Indeed, all the evidence seems to suggest that Winterfell is the epicentre of this winter. The closer you get to Winterfell, the more wintry it gets, and it's perhaps even emanating out from there. If you'll excuse the wordplay, because I think it's originally from George R. R. Martin, it's as if winter fell at Winterfell, and is now spreading out from there. Let me explain. Within a couple of months of that layer of snow that Theon saw, which was already pretty bad, there were snowdrifts that were high enough to hide doorways. Winterfell is almost buried in snow, and things are only getting worse. 6 of the 7 gates are frozen shut. Visibility outside in the snowstorm is so bad you can literally barely see your outstretched hand. The snowdrifts against the curtain wall are now 40 feet deep and getting deeper. That's 12 metres and rising. Snowdrifts more than 6 humans standing on each other's shoulders deep, and all in a matter of a couple of months, and getting worse. Maybe you might think this is just a bad winter, or coming from the others north of the wall, but it's not. Winterfell has it way, way worse than anywhere else, even places far to the north. It's snowing at the wall, but nowhere near that bad. Despite being 600 miles, that's nearly 1,000 kilometres further north, the worst drifts there are just over a man's height. Winterfell's are 7 times deeper, and we're told repeatedly that the weather at Castle Black is coming from the south, not the north and the others. We also have a real-time chapter from Asher's perspective, showing what it's like to try to march towards Winterfell from Deepwood Motte, which is 300 miles northwest of Winterfell. When they set off southeast, the weather seems quite crisp but pleasant. There's a frost on the grass and plenty of descriptions of how the morning sun glinted off the knight's armour. A bit chilly perhaps, but a long, long way from the conditions at Winterfell at the same time. Everyone is in good spirits and they make good progress. They expect the journey to take 15 days at a leisurely pace. Some jest that Robert Baratheon would have done it in 10. On the 4th day, the snow starts to fall in gentle flurries. It clearly hadn't been snowing for them before that. The closer they get to Winterfell, the worse it gets, and the slower they move. By day 15, when they should have already reached Winterfell, we read that a trail of broken wains and frozen corpses stretched back behind them, buried beneath the blowing snow. The sun and moon and stars had been gone so long that Asher was starting to wonder whether she had dreamed them. They are maybe halfway there, and people are already freezing to death, buried in the snow. By day 34, they manage barely half a mile in a day before coming to a halt in the crofters' village we know, still quite a few miles short of Winterfell, where they basically give up. Horses and men are dying from the cold, and the snow is so deep they can't even hope to make it to Winterfell. It seems that the closer you get to Winterfell, the closer you get to the heart of winter. a phrase I chose carefully because the heart of winter means something in this world. If you'll forgive the digression because I think it's quite relevant, we first hear the phrase in an early Bran chapter. He's unconscious after Jaime had pushed him from the window of the first keep and has a vision. Finally, he looked north, and he looked past the wall, past endless forests cloaked in snow, past the frozen shore and the great blue-white rivers of ice and the dead plains where nothing grew or lived. North and north and north he looked, to the curtain of light at the end of the world, and then beyond that curtain. He looked deep into the heart of winter. And then he cried out, afraid, and the heat of his tears burned on his cheeks. "Now you know," the crow whispered as it sat on his shoulder. "Now you know why you must live." "Why?" Bran said, not understanding. Falling. "Because winter is coming." Immediately, we get the connection between the others and the Starks with winter is coming. Then compare that with the Theon POV when he is rescuing Jane Poole from Winterfell in the midst of that winter. They were in the heart of Winterfell, with the castle all around them, but no sign of it could be seen. They might have easily been lost amidst the lands of always winter, 1,000 leagues beyond the wall. George R. R. Martin is deliberately echoing the phrase, the heart of winter, where the others seem to come from, with the heart of Winterfell, saying that it felt like the lands of always winter. Basically, the castle has disappeared under the snow. Again, we get this connection between the Starks, Winterfell, and the others. But let's jump back inside the castle to see what's really going on. Because in that 2-book break, the Boltons have headed up there for the marriage of Ramsay Bolton and Jane Poole, who is disguised as Arya. The political point here is pretty straightforward. Marrying Roos's now legitimised bastard son to a Stark gives them a claim to Winterfell. Ramsay is now head of a new house, a cadet branch of his father's, House Bolton of Winterfell. Some may have been fooled by that, but you can be sure that the Weirwood network wasn't. The Winterfell Godswood is where that wedding took place, and Theon thinks that the ravens mutter murderously and the Weirwood laughs as the wedding takes place. Something is wrong and different. The death imagery again is everywhere. Theon thinks that Jane looks like a corpse bride. Tree roots are half buried. Again, that quote, it felt like some strange underworld, some timeless place between the worlds, where the damned wandered mournfully for a time, before finding their way down to whatever hell their sins had earned them. Are we all dead then? Seriously, this should be a wedding, but it feels more like a wake. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that something was broken when the last Stark left Winterfell. Winterfell was a living, breathing place while the Starks were there. We get that imagery time and again, but now it is dead. We don't yet know all the details of the pact or magic that was broken by the Starks leaving Winterfell, but Bran and Rickon leaving triggered winter to fall in Winterfell, and the wedding of a fake Stark only seems to exacerbate things. Interestingly, the only 2 places that seem to retain some warmth are the Godswood around the Weirwood tree. Remember Theon talking about warm mists while the rest of Winterfell is buried under snow, and the crypts. When Theon goes down there, he notes that, as they descended, the air grew warmer. Not warm, never warm, but warmer than above. There, below the earth, it would seem, the chill was constant, unchanging. Perhaps Bran was right. Winterfell above ground looked dead, but the real Winterfell wasn't dead, just broken. At which point, let me bring you back to what we concluded last video, that the original Winterfell was not actually the castle itself, but the crypts and the Weirwood tree above it. Winterfell Castle as a whole seems to be dead. Just skim through the Theon chapters to see how many references there are to death and ghosts, and by the time Theon escapes, it is so covered by snow, it has basically disappeared. But the real Winterfell, the original Winterfell, the crypts and the area around the Weirwood tree, they are just broken, which suggests that they can be mended. How? Well, presumably by the Starks returning to Winterfell. We'll probably get quite a lot of the Winds of Winter first, but this is a hint of hope. Winter emanating from Winterfell can be stopped. So, who might be the first Stark back in Winterfell? To be honest, they are all quite a long way away. Jon seems likely to head there at some point to try and take it back from the Boltons. That was what he was planning to do when he got the pink letter. Yes, he was killed, but he's probably coming back from that. But he's secretly a Targaryen, not a Stark. So will the magic reset when he gets to Winterfell? Perhaps it will be another clue to his parentage, which obviously still hasn't been revealed in the books. So perhaps Rickon or Bran. Davos has gone to look for Rickon, and although the timelines aren't 100% clear, that seems to have been a few months ago, so perhaps he will appear sooner than we think. Bran, however, is perhaps a couple of 1,000 kilometres north in Bloodraven's cave, and his disability makes travel slower. Don't expect him to arrive any time earlier than the end of the Winds of Winter. Arya and Sansa are similarly both a long way away. Any way you look at it, there won't be a Stark in Winterfell for a while, certainly until the second half of the Winds of Winter, and in the meantime, winter falling in Winterfell will impact on the plot in massive ways. Winterfell itself will be snowed in, travel to and from it will be slow and dangerous. Stannis' offensive has ground to a halt, so the battle in the ice between Stannis' forces and Rooses will take place away from Winterfell. On the show, what prompted Melisandre to sacrifice Shireen was to alleviate the weather for Stannis. Perhaps a little of the impact was lost there because the weather we saw on screen wasn't even slightly comparable to what we read in the book, but that probably makes it more likely that the sacrifice will happen. If Melisandre sees in the fires her Azor Ahai reborn freezing and unable to move in the ice and snow, and maybe even if he asks her for help, would she not do whatever magic it took to help him from afar? And perhaps that frees Stannis to attack Winterfell, a newly resuscitated Jon to march south, or Ramsay to head out to hunt rumours of Rickon returning. What if Jon heading south with an army coincides with the others reaching the wall? The possibilities are manifold. These are the kinds of possibilities that George R. R. Martin, as a Gardner writer, spends his time considering. Might Rickon or Bran reach Winterfell and restore the magic there before the others reach the wall? How bad might the winter around Winterfell get? Which is more powerful, Winterfell's origin magic or Melisandre's? Ultimately, only he gets to decide those things. So where does all this leave us? Clearly, when the last Stark in Winterfell left, some kind of magic was broken. Underground, the original Winterfell, things may stay as they were, but above ground, winter has fallen to a crazy degree, and seemingly emanating from Winterfell itself. Winterfell is dead, buried by the snow. The language George R. R. Martin uses reinforces this continually. This will impact on the entire northern plotline. Stannis' march on Winterfell, Melisandre at the wall, everything. Though, as Bran notes, the real Winterfell is not actually dead, just broken. The question is, when will the Starks return? And fundamentally, why does it all matter? Clearly, Winterfell is tied to the Starks and also tied to the defences against the return of the others, but what defence could Winterfell actually offer? Why is it so important that Winterfell be fully operational? That's what we'll look at in the next video. But let me know what you think about the Winterfell theory in the comments below. If you'd like to see the other videos in this series, there's a playlist appearing now on the left of your screen. Or if you'd like to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon on the right of your screen. Thanks for watching. That's all for this time. I'll see you again soon.